Chapter 23. Although Harry had thought that 2 months of being away from the constant stress and danger of school would be overwhelming, he found himself going stir-crazy after just 3 weeks. Vernon had treated Harry like a bomb that was about to go off, and Harry had worked very hard to keep everything as inoffensive as possible. He emphasized just how dangerous school had been and about how he had been pushed off a set of stairs and almost murdered. He didn't talk about his own murder, but from the way the Dursleys treated him, there was some kind of change in the way he looked. Harry suspected that he seemed harder and more dangerous somehow. The fact that he was mentally 8 months older than he was physically might be part of it as well. As a Slytherin, he'd learned to control his emotions and to show how he felt much less. This made tolerating Vernon's rages and Petunia's pettiness a little easier, as he didn't make things worse by responding as he had when he was younger. Yet even though things had settled into a kind of sullen sameness in the household, they weren't like they had been when Harry was younger. When he was younger, he had been taken to the grocery store to help carry the groceries while Dudley taunted him. He'd walked to school and back, and he'd even been able to visit the library on his own, if he didn't take too long from his chores. Now the Dursleys refused to take him anywhere. They went out to eat and left him behind, bringing him the leftovers from Vernon and Petunia's meals. Dudley never had any leftovers. There were no more trips to the grocery store, and the Dursleys were even afraid to allow him to do much work outside, even despite Harry's assurances that the wards covered the yard. The Dursleys didn't want anyone to realize he was there, because they'd somehow learned about the bounty on his head. Vernon had tried to make Harry stop carry his wand, but Harry had refused. He'd made the point that if the wards failed, Harry's wand would be their only defense. He also pointed out that he was allowed one free use of underage magic. Paling at the implicit threat, Vernon had backed down. Harry had overheard his aunt and uncle talking about putting bars on his door and locking him in. He'd quickly interceded and pointed out that, as long as he had his wand, he could simply explode the wall, which might hurt someone else in the family as well as be costly. Vernon had blustered again, but eventually had given in. Harry had worked hard after that on making his family feel that he was on their side of things. He'd denigrated the wizarding world, and he'd loudly expressed his envy of Dudley for going to Smeltings. The truth was, he did envy Dudley. For months out of the year, the worst he had to worry about was getting a thrashing by the older boys. Eventually, Harry had run out of books to read. He'd gone over his homework multiple times. He'd practiced sneaking around the house at night, practicing his skills at stealth so they didn't get rusty. He'd even tried to enlist Dudley's help by having him pelt Harry with tennis balls while Harry dodged. Dudley had taken a vicious pleasure in this at first, but he'd had trouble hitting Harry and had quickly lost interest. After 3 weeks, Harry felt stir-crazy. He could feel his skills atrophying, and he worried that by the time school resumed, he'd be terribly vulnerable. So he cheated, slipping on his invisibility cloak one day while the Dursleys were away, and he headed for the library nearby. He found a book there, Methods of Disguise, which had over 130 illustrations, including makeup, shoe lifts, contact lenses, fake tattoos, wigs, and transvestite disguises. It had a section on how people identity other people and on changing voices. He checked out this book along with some books on acting and a few fiction books to take his mind off things. He'd had little enough fun in his entire life, much less since he'd been isolated by much of the Hogwarts population. Harry called Hermione as often as he could when the Dursleys were away, and she kept in contact with Neville, who owled her. It was never enough, and Harry found himself missing the times they'd spent together in the library. He wondered if he should start teaching them to fight during the next term. Even poorly trained opponents would help him get better if there were enough of them. If it weren't for the trace, Harry would have continued practicing whatever magics that he could. As it was, he wished he could find some way around it. He doubted that it would be easy to find. Most likely the Ministry restricted any information on the trace. The one thing he did know was that it couldn't distinguish between magic the teenager cast and magic cast around him. In a location like Hogwarts or Diagon Alley, it wouldn't notice a spell cast at all. According to Neville, children in wizarding families were often able to cast spells outside of school simply by staying near their parents, which gave purebloods a powerful advantage over their muggle-born compatriots. Harry practiced his disguise skills as much as he could with the materials he had on hand. He'd had Hermione send him £100 through Muggle mail, promising he'd pay her and her family back once he got to Diagon Alley and got to his vault. He bought a makeup kit and began practicing on prosthesis for his nose and on blending. Dudley had tried to make fun of him for it, but for once Petunia and Vernon had been on Harry's side. A disguised Harry was a Harry who was less of a danger to them all. Finally, his birthday tolled around again on July 31st. The Dursleys didn't celebrate it, of course, but his aunt did leave a collection of her old makeup in a box at his door. The Dursleys were having guests that night, and the one thing Vernon asked of Harry was that he be quiet and discreet. The last thing they needed was for the guests to talk about Harry to the wrong people. As Harry was in total agreement, the deal was made. Harry settled in for a quiet evening reading his books. Unfortunately, fate had another plan in the form of a mad house elf. Harry had discovered the house elves during his explorations of Hogwarts, and he'd already used them to deliver pieces of wood, as well as for other tasks. In his experience, they all seemed to have an overstated opinion of his importance. The house elf sitting on his bed wasn't nearly as well dressed as the Hogwarts house elves, who wore a uniform made of tea towels. This house elf was wearing an old pillowcase. "Harry Potter," the house elf began, "such an honor to meet you, sir. So long has Dobby wanted to meet you." House elves were a partial exception to the wards on Harry's house. Unlike wizards, they could find his home, but only if they had no ill intent toward him. To house elves and other magical creatures who wished him harm, Harry's house was just as invisible as it was to anyone else. Of course, there were ways around this. Harry had been concerned about the exception. Convince the house elf that he was helping Harry, and it might deliver him straight to the Dark Lord himself. "How did you find me here?" Harry asked quickly. "This place is supposed to be secret." "Dobby talked to the Hogwarts elves who knew your mother," the house elf said. "Some helped at her wedding and met her sister and her husband. One knew the names." "Still," Harry said, "how did you know where they lived?" "The Muggles have a book, sir," the house elf said. "It has the names and addresses of all the Muggles in a city." Harry stared at the creature, feeling a chill go down his spine. The house elves knew enough to let someone find him. Given the ignorance of wizards to Muggle ways, Harry suspected that one of the house elves had probably served a half-blood and had known enough to give Dobby some friendly advice. The only thing that was keeping him safe was wizards' arrogance and belief that their slaves were ignorant and knew nothing. "Did you tell your master where I live?" Harry asked, staring at the creature intently. The creature shook his head. "My master doesn't know Dobby knows. He can't ever know. If he knew—" Harry could hear the sounds of his aunt's laughter below. "This isn't a very good time," Harry said. "I've spent a lot of time trying to get into my aunt and uncle's good graces." "It is important, sir," the creature said. He leaned forward. "Dobby heard that Harry Potter faced the Dark Lord again a few weeks ago." Harry was silent for a long moment. The only one who knew about that was Voldemort, although Dumbledore suspected. Dobby's master had to be one of the Death Eaters, and that meant Voldemort had already found enough of a host to communicate with his underlings. "I'm not admitting to anything," Harry said neutrally, "but what would it mean if I had?" "Harry Potter is very great, sir." The house elf wiped his eyes with the edge of his pillowcase, "but he still must not return to Hogwarts this year. He must stay here where he is safe. If he returns to Hogwarts, he will be in mortal danger." Harry stared at the creature. "You think I don't know that? Voldemort plans to kill me, and he knows exactly where I'll be every year when school's in session." The creature moaned and covered his ears. "Don't speak the name! Don't speak the name, sir!" The sounds of the party below reminded Harry that he needed to keep the creature as quiet and unobtrusive as popular. "I'm supposed to kill him. I should be able to say his name at least," Harry said. "But fine. There is a plot at Hogwarts, terrible things. I have known about it for months," the creature said. Harry dropped down to rest on his haunches, bringing his face level with Dobby's. "Can you tell me about the plot?" "No. Dobby will have to punish himself for telling Harry Potter even as much as he has. He will have to shut his head in the oven." The creature grabbed Harry's table lamp and began bashing himself in the head. Harry quickly stopped him and said, "You can't seriously think I want to go, do you? Then why does Harry Potter go?" "They make me," Harry said. "Dumbledore and the Ministry. It doesn't matter what I want or my family wants." Half the wizarding world wanted him there, and the other half wanted him there, so they could kill him. There had never been a choice about his going to magic school. The elf stared up at Harry, as if the idea that he wouldn't want to go had never occurred to him. "If you can tell me a little more about the plot, maybe I can stop it before it gets started," Harry said. As the house elf lunged for the lamp again, Harry held up his hand. "But I know you can't betray your masters." He'd looked up house elves at the same time he'd looked up acromantulas and werewolves. He'd always found their bulging eyes and subservient attitudes a little creepy, even if they were very helpful. As far as Harry was concerned, anyone who worshipped him couldn't be trusted. Neither could anyone who hated him. Even people who pretended not to care about him couldn't be trusted. Harry's list of people to trust could be written on a fingernail. "You must stay here, where it is safe," Dobby said insistently. "I don't have a choice," Harry said. He gestured toward his doorway. "My aunt and uncle didn't want me to go to that school in the first place, but the wizards didn't give them a choice. None of us can stop them from making me go." "But why?" Dobby asked. "They want me to kill the Dark Lord," Harry said, "and they've set me out like some kind of sacrificial lamb." After that, there wasn't much to say. The house elf left, dejected. Harry felt a little depressed. He'd known there would be a plan to kill him this year as well, but it was depressing to have confirmation before he even stepped on the train. Harry had worked hard on his disguise for his visit to Diagon Alley. He was wearing some of Dudley's old clothing, which he'd stuffed with old rags. He'd changed his hair using the magical comb the Weasleys had given him to a blonde bowl cut. He was wearing inserts in his shoes to make him taller. He'd practiced walking like a heavy person, using Dudley's walk as a guide. This year, he'd decided against endangering the Grangers. For one thing, everyone knew he was friends with Hermione, and being with them would simply endanger his disguise. He had a second set of clothes on inside Dudley's huge clothes. He'd have to change when he got his new robes, or they wouldn't fit at all. Harry had gotten £300 from his aunt for his Hogwarts books. £100 was for the money he'd spent over the summer to repay Hermione, and the rest so that she wouldn't know about his vault. He had no idea how much or how little money was in his vault anyway, and he couldn't depend on that money until he saw it. If he had plenty of money, he planned on keeping the £200 for emergencies. After all the trouble the Dursleys had given him over the years, he figured they owed it to him. He walked more than a mile under his invisibility cloak until he reached a deserted place. He then put his cloak away and lifted his wand, summoning the night bus. As it arrived, Harry kept one hand on his wand. Being attacked on the bus itself was always a possibility, and from his recollection, riding the bus was unpleasant. All the wizarding methods of travel were unpleasant. The flu network tossed you around. Apparition felt like being squeezed from a tube. Broom travel was probably the best, but it still involved getting bugs in one's teeth. The night bus was simply inhumane. If he survived the war with Voldemort, Harry decided that he would work on comfortable means of transportation. He'd make a mint and never have to work again. It'd be nice to be known as the boy who created comfortable and affordable travel, instead of just the boy who lived. Fortunately, the bus trip was uneventful. Arriving at Diagon Alley, Harry began to get into his character. He began to walk like a heavy person. In his first year, being alone had been a red flag. No one sent a first year to Diagon Alley alone. However, with the shoe inserts and other aspects to his disguise, Harry thought he might be able to pass for a second or third year, and some of them did wander the alley alone. Harry made sure that he walked as though he didn't have a care in the world. Walking like he was afraid was sure to attract predators. His first stop was to Gringotts. Dumbledore had been reluctant to give him his key and had told him he wouldn't have full access to his vault until he was 17. He'd finally given in after Harry had pleaded with him and sold him a sob story about how the Dursleys didn't want to finance his education and that it would be an injustice to force them to do so. A horrifying ride later, Harry was at his vault. The coins in his vault were impressive, piles of gold, silver and nuts. According to the goblin he was with, he had 50,000 galleons worth in total. It was a small fortune, but it wasn't enough to live off of for a lifetime by any means. Given the exchange rate, it might be enough to buy a rather nice house, but that would be it. For Harry, though, it felt like all the money in the world. The £300 his aunt had given him, plus the money he'd earned the summer before, were all the money he'd ever had in his life. He gathered money, more than he thought he would need, since it would have to last for the year at Hogwarts, and he left his vault with a sense of anticipation. Seeing the father of Weasley and Malfoy get into a fist fight in the middle of the street was less surprising than Harry had thought it would be. Apparently, the younger duo's feud was something of a family tradition. Seeing Malfoy Sr. hand a book to the youngest Weasley girl afterwards was somewhat suspicious, but Harry decided that it was none of his business. With money, Diagon Alley was much more interesting. Harry had made it a point to learn the shrinking charm from Flitwick before the end of the last term. He'd asked for a variant that would end on its own after a time. He could cast spells in Diagon Alley, as there was too much other magic for the trace to notice, but reversing the spell at home would trigger the trace. He used it now to buy more books than he could have possibly fit in his backpack, along with the other supplies he would need. He spent more time on his books than any other issue, simply because he needed something to occupy the next month with, and learning new magic would help occupy the time. The most dangerous part of the trip was when he went to get school robes. He slipped into the store and had to find a place that was out of the way and unseen by anyone else to slip off the heavy clothes that had made him look fat. He took off the inserts in his trainers that had made him taller. He used the comb to change his hair, and he got his robes as quickly as possible. Leaving Diagon Alley with his new look, Harry summoned the night bus again. He had it take him to a different part of town than he'd left from, and he went home hidden under his invisibility cloak. He barely reached his room before the shrinking charms ran out, exploding objects all across the floor. The fact that he wasn't murdered on his way back from Diagon Alley was a good sign. Maybe this year wouldn't be as traumatic as the last.